Chapter 12. So here we're talking about the implementation stage of this whole program planning process. So we left off uh, last chapter talking about marketing the program and things to consider. Certainly, that's going to be an important component. Um, you have to be able to sell interest in your program in order to get the levels of participation that um, allow you to be an effective agent of change within the community with regard to your identified health issues and the identified behaviors you need to change. So as we approach this implementation of our program plan, there's a few more steps we need to take uh, just to kind of encapsulate your plan um, in a way that allows you to kind of see the big picture, basically how each component of your plan leads you a step closer to meeting your objectives and ultimately your program goal.
Okay, so to do this, we're going to utilize what's called logic models. Okay, so a logic model is just kind of what I said. It's a graphical representation of all the things you plan on doing within the program, and it also gives a bit of information as to, okay, well, if I plan to do a certain activity, what's the payoff? What is it doing in terms of helping me meet my objectives? So at this point, you have to have a complete list of objectives. You need to have kind of an idea of what strategies you're going to utilize for each objective, and you also need to have an understanding of what resources are needed for each of those strategies. And we present all of that information in a single logic model. Now, the other benefit of the logic model is when you're explaining the entire program to someone that may not be familiar with the inner workings of the program. But so basically you can show them this one page logic model, and from there they can kind of see how all the components fit together. Can be a valuable tool, especially if you're trying to garner support for the program. You can kind of in a very short amount of time, you can kind of explain, here's what my program's all about, here's what I plan to do, here's how it's going to contribute to meeting the goal, and which ultimately is in alignment with the organization's mission statement. Three components of a logic model. Actually, it should be four, but I'll kind of talk about where they combine things. So inputs. Well, let me stop here. Let me back up. So you need to build these logic models from right to left, but read it from left to right. So what does that mean? That means that you start with your outcomes and you work backwards to build the logic model. But again, when you present the logic model, you start with your resources and work your way again from left to right, and end with talking about your outcomes. So we'll start here with our outcomes. So results or effects: short term, midterm, long term. These are just kind of rule of thumb segments as far as short term, midterm, long term. But and we'll stick with this particular format for this lecture. But what short-term, midterm, long-term refers to are actually the by-when components of your objective statements. Right? So if you have a by-when that happens early on during the program implementation, well, that's going to be your short-term. Right? Things that happen within the intermediate time period of your program, it's going to be your midterm, and objectives that have a by-when that are closer to the end of your program, we'll refer to those as long term. So when you're building your outcomes and you consider your by-wins of your objectives, actually what we're going to focus on now are your what change, and you can even include your how much of a change components. So if you had, an objective statement that was like, by the first 3 weeks of program implementation, all participants will have increased their physical activity levels by 50%. Right, so that's going to be a short-term outcome. So what you would put in there is increase physical activity levels by 50%. Right, that's the outcome that you're shooting for. Now, if we work backwards, right, and we consider the output and in parentheses activities, and here's where they combine things. Typically in a logic model, outputs and activities are separate components. So the outputs, that would be kind of what change needs to occur in order for your outcome to be realized. So for physical activity to increase 50%, and say, we need to look at, okay, well, they need to have a skills development, right? They need to learn what skills they need to possess in order to engage in physical activities, right? So your output would be a change in skills. The activity would be, okay, well, what activity are you going to use that produces a change in skills, right? So maybe it's a physical activity demonstration seminar, right? That would be the actual activity. Then for inputs, you want to look at, okay, well, what are all the resources I would need in order to conduct the activity, right? Doing the physical activity seminar, right? Which produces the output of development of skills or change in skills, which contributes to the outcome increasing physical activity by 50%. So here is a generic logic model, and as you can see, it's broken up into 4 components here. We have inputs, activities, outputs, and then your outcomes. And in some cases, you would have a 5th component to the far right that would be your goal, right? The ultimate program goal. So the idea is how a logic model works is that you build it, remember I said from right to left, but you read it from left to right. So you would say, okay, what's invested, your input, what's the resource requirement in terms of personnel, money, time, those sorts of things. Yeah, is if I have those things, then I can conduct the activity, right? So borrowing from my previous example, I would offer the physical physical activity demonstration, right? After they go through that activity, right, the output of that particular activity should be a change in skills, and then that output would contribute to the short-term outcome of increasing physical activity by 50%. Okay, that's how it is supposed to work. Okay, so now we're talking about implementation. So at this point, implementation really just means that, okay, now we're actually putting participants into the program plan and we are running the program plan, right? Implementation is, everything that occurs from the program start to the program end. Now, down here with adoption and sustainability, we'll get into that in the next slide, but here's what we're talking about. So within implementation, there are phases. Now, don't confuse these phases with the precede proceed model phases, because it can get kind of confusing because they use the term phases to describe each component of implementation and precede proceed. And to further confuse things, implementation is represented by phase 5 of the precede proceed model, but within that particular phase there's going to be 5 phases of implementation, right? Sounds clear as mud, but I didn't get to pick the descriptors. They're already there. All right, so what are the phases of implementation? So adoption of the program, identifying and prioritizing the tasks to be completed, tasks/activities, establishing a system of management, putting the plans into action, and then finally ending or sustaining a program. Okay, so we'll step through each of these. Okay, so adoption of the program. Here's where that marketing mix that we talked about in chapter 11 comes into play. So you've made your decisions on what your marketing kind of activities are going to look like. That means you've identified your target audience and kind of uncovered their communication channels and that sort of thing. But this is a very critical step in implementation, because what you're trying to do is recruit participants for your program. Your program can be groundbreaking in its approach to behavior change. It could be just an amazing plan, but you can never escape the fact that without participation, that plan is worthless, right? There's no benefit to human health if nobody participates in this exemplary plan. So focusing on getting people to sign up and participate in your program, right, is a critical component of program success. Identifying and prioritizing the tasks to be completed. So what you want to look at are basically your activities from your logic model. What resources do you have on hand? What resources do you need to secure? How do you deploy resources to produce the activity? And you also want to think about, is there some type of sequential order in which I need to address these activities? So that's where the prioritizing comes into play. You want to make sure that if certain activities are needed in order to realize your short-term outcomes, well then you better make sure you have those particular resources on hand and have those activities deployed so that you can in fact have a shot at meeting your short-term outcomes. So some things just take longer to do than other, right? So if you have to order materials, right, are there delays in shipping? All right, is there a lead time that's needed? If you're ordering things that have a particular logo, right, is there like a creative process that you have to go through in order to create the logo, in order to brand the materials that you're ordering, right? So those are things you need to be thinking about, right? When can I get things, and when do I actually need them? That's going to help you prioritize. So putting this into a timetable or timeline can kind of help you see, okay, well, what do I need to be doing at any given moment? All right, so speaking of timelines and calendars and this sort of thing, there's a lot of different ways that you can represent the time needed and the sequential order of things. You can do it in basic timelines. Something has a line from start date to end date, and then you just kind of fill in the line along the way of things that need to be accomplished. Task development timelines, Gantt chart, PERT charts, CPMs. Again, these are just different formats of presenting a timeline in a way that, again, how effective is the the graphical representation, right? Is efficient use, right? You want something that is easily understood. That way you can avoid overlooking things in terms of sequence. And then here's what I mean by a graphical representation, right? You should be able to kind of view the calendar or the timeline, and at any given moment, right, you should be able to say, okay, here's what needs to be done. So if we go and look at this top one and we look at November, we go down to, okay, well, in November we should be in phase 2 of the intervention. Okay. If we go down to year 2 and look in November, right? There should be a total implementation, so the program should be full steam ahead. And the other thing we need to make sure we're doing is continued follow-up for long-term events. So just kind of make sure we're collecting data. A Gantt chart. Um, Gantt charts are kind of my preference because they have multiple things going on any given time. So again, if we go down here to November, we go down to, okay, well, we know that we're in the evaluation phase of the program. So here we should be making sure we have the data on hand, we have the appropriate analyses, we're going through our objectives and evaluating those, and we've given ourselves 2 months, November and December, to do that. And we go down here to the legend. Okay, that's kind of our plan. But once we complete doing those things, then we would come back and underline. So maybe we completed them in November. We'd put an underline there so that, again, at a glance, people can look at and they say, look, pilot test for the program. Well, that was completed over May and June. Prepare for program kickoff. Okay, so currently we're in August, and we're working on completing this as we go through the month of August. So again, a lot of information can be presented in a very efficient way in terms of this Gantt chart. Okay, phase 3 of implementation: establishing a system of management. Right, so you have all these things going on, all these activities, you have personnel working on these things, you have participants that are coming and going, right? You have to have some oversight. So how are you going to do that? How are you going to identify an individual, groups of individual, to make sure that the plan is, sticking to schedule? Depending on the size of your program and the size of the number of personnel that you have, some people may be wearing a lot of hats, but you need to work that out ahead of time so that everybody knows what the expectations are, what their responsibilities are, so that they can kind of gauge their progress through the administration of the program. You want to consider things like human resources. Okay, how are you managing your personnel? A lot goes into managing personnel. I didn't ever realize how much until I was a manager, and the toughest part for me was letting go of various aspects of the program. I kind of wanted to make sure that everything was functioning properly, but you can't micromanage like that and really be effective. So being able to let go of certain areas and designate someone else to kind of be in charge of that, sounds easy to do, but in practice may not be. So definitely a skill set involved with management. Financial management, right? You've established a budget, and maybe you were funded specific to that budget. Well, if you're not sticking to the budget, things are running over in terms of costs. That's going to be problematic. So the sooner someone's able to kind of identify that this is happening, the sooner you can respond to it. So having someone that's going through the receipts and looking at the balance in the account and managing that. Another thing to consider are your technical resources. Whether it's just computer resources, laptops, maybe you're using audiovisual resources during seminars, right? Having someone making sure that everything's working. If you're using social media or a website, well, what happens if the website crashes or there's technical issues involved with that? Who's going to address that? Right, you farm it out, contract it out, or you have a technical resource on board. But again, things you need to consider, and kind of what you're after is, again, efficiency and effectiveness in the way that this program is being implemented. Okay, so I keep mentioning the terms effective and efficient. That you have to gauge all your decisions based on that, right? Because we're trying to maximize the utilization of the resources that we have, right? We want to use resources in a way that's an effective use, right? So we're producing results, but we also have to keep in mind that resources are finite. So we have to be efficient with the use. Human resource management for functions, right? Planning, right? Who needs to do what, right? So during your planning phase, right, you have all these activities. Who's conducting those activities? Who's overseeing the group of activities to make sure that they're being implemented as designed? Acquisition. Okay, well, we identify some gaps, some needs for personnel. Well, how are we going to put personnel in that position? How are we going to hire personnel? Development. Well, if we have a certain standard for how these activities are to be implemented, and we have a personnel that aren't trained to reach those standards, well, that's going to be a problem, right? So we need to identify, well, what training do we need to offer to get everybody on the same page? And unfortunately, you also have to consider sanctions. What to do when personnel aren't performing to those standards, right? What are your recourse? And then professional development. Again, how can we make sure that our personnel are as equipped as they need to be, right, to do their jobs well? Financial management, right? Not really my favorite part of the planning and implementation process, but it is absolutely necessary. You're working with grant funds. Your resources have costs, right? Managing the funds to cover the costs and not going into the red, is something that you have to look at. So, someone with accounting skills, again, or you farm this out. Knowing what your fiscal year is in terms of when do you receive disbursements from the grant funds, when do you have to produce deliverables to show the ROI to the grantees. Fiscal accountability, okay, who has oversight, right? Who's in charge? At bottom line, whose signature is on the approval sheets. Audits, right? Do you want to do QC, quality control measures throughout, and just say, you know what, at the first 3 weeks, let's do an audit just to see how things are being, how resources are being utilized. Are we on track with everything? Technical resource management. Again, you need to look at what equipment you're using. Who can fix that? Maybe there's a service rep from the company you purchased the equipment from. Maybe you're handling everything in-house. Again, you have to think about those, and you have to address them as they come up. Phase 4 of the implementation phase. So here, putting the plans into action. Right, so here we're looking at, okay, what we're doing, we're transitioning from this plan on paper to the plan working with actual participants. So you need to think about, okay, well, how do you want to approach this rollout of the program? A couple different things you can consider. All right, pilot testing, right? So you call out a representative sample of your target population, and you expose them to the elements of the program. And the idea is that you can kind of see what works and what doesn't work, and you have an opportunity to go in and kind of tweak things, fix things. That's great, right? If you can incorporate pilot testing into your implementation, go for it. But just realize that pilot testing is going to consume resources, right? It's going to consume time right off the bat. It has to occur before actual implementation. You're going to be utilizing resources to implement this pilot test. So you have to go back and reconcile against your budget and say, do I have the necessary resources to facilitate a pilot test? that's something, it's going to be a case by case type of thing, or maybe you plan on pilot testing from the beginning and you incorporate that into your budget request early on, and you can kind of address those things. Phasing in. So here's where, so say we were going to deliver a program at a school, and we decide that, okay, well, we're only going to present or expose the students with the last name of N through Z. And then the following semester, now we're going to involve the students A through M. Right, so that you're phasing in. This really, I guess it depends on when you're receiving disbursements, right? That may influence you to phase in. Phasing in also allows you to do some statistical analyses in terms of pre and post. You can collect data, baseline data prior to phase in and then after phase in. It's just situationally dependent if you decide to go that route. Or finally, you could just decide to, on Monday, March 9th, that's going to be our start day. The whole shebang goes off on that day. All the participants show up and we start the program. Typically, that's how most programs are rolled out in total program form. So we go through here and we look at the pros and the cons for each way. All right, so with pilot testing, right, so the advantages are opportunity to test a program, close control of the program, right? It's smaller, it's more manageable, you get to see things. A disadvantage, very few are involved, so, in terms of success, right, it's only going to be possible among those involved. Not meeting all the needs, again, you're using a subgroup. Hard to generalize about results. Possibly, if your sample that's used in the pilot test is truly representative of your target population, then generalizability is going to be a little bit easier. But if you say, I'm asking for some volunteers to participate in this pilot program, and what if they were all female, but your total target population is a mix of male and female? Well, the results of the pilot test may not be generalizable back to your target population simply because you have no male representation, and that can be held true for the distribution of all the demographics in the target population if it isn't mirrored or represented in your pilot sample. Phased in, easier cope with workload, right? Because the idea is that we're not addressing everybody early on. We're phasing it in to a smaller group. It's more manageable. Gradual investment, right? You're not dumping all your resources at day one. You're kind of feeding it in slowly. Fewer people involved, right? So when you phase in, not everyone's involved, so not everyone's going to receive a benefit. And then total program rollout advantages, more people involved, right? It's your target population. Evaluation more meaningful with larger group, your sample power increases, that sort of thing. Disadvantage is big commitment, right? You're saying it's now or never. We're going forward. No chance to test the program. No, you're kind of figuring out as you go along. You're discovering challenges. You're discovering what people like, and hopefully you're able to react and make some tweaks that ultimately prove to be effective. All right, so the first day of implementation. Usually it's associated with some kickoff event. The programs that I've been involved in, you try to create a lot of buzz about the program. In the work site, we've kind of started the program with planned health fairs that were going to be on campus or on the work site. One is just, like I said, just get everybody motivated and excited about the program, and you may attract additional participants because of all the fanfare that's happening with your kickoff. deciding on a first day, right? So, okay, when is your, hold on, I'm dog sitting. Okay, I'm back. So, deciding on the day you're going to implement this program, if you can launch it to coincide with some other event that's happening, right? More power to you, right? That event, right? In the expectation is it's already generating its own buzz, right? You're just kind of latching on to that. So um, again, you just want to make this significant uh, to your participants so that it's easy for them to remember. Oh yeah, today's the first day of that program I signed up. Today's the first day it starts. So um, again, anything you can kind of do to improve the affect or the mood surrounding the program, that's always a benefit. Right. So like I was saying, kickoff in style, just get that buzz, get everybody's motivation levels up. Seek news coverage if appropriate. Again, depending on your target audience and how they consume information, right? You may want to see if there is um, some type of media outlet that kind of plays in that particular way of social media that is likely to again reach your target audience. Okay, monitoring implementation. So the idea here is that on the very first day, that's when data collection potentially starts as well. So if you're collecting data continuously through the program and you know the purpose of that data, right, because you've created smart objectives, and you've thought about, okay, well, how am I analyzing this data and what does the results tell me? Um, Simply means that you can perform analyses continuously, monitor those results, and just keep an eye on, are they trending in the appropriate directions. If they're not, right, so now you have an opportunity to go and kind of delve into this a little bit more. Okay, well, why aren't they? Do I need to do something differently, or what's going on? So that's the idea of this program monitoring is that it's like putting your fingers on the pulse of the program, and you're detecting for things going as planned, but more importantly, you're detecting things that aren't going as planned. All right, so the final phase of implementation, ending or sustaining a program. So you need to decide, okay, well, when your time is done, right? So maybe you've been assigned to a project for 6 months, right? At the end of that 6 months, what's going to happen? Well, one thing's for sure, um, at that point is that, okay, well, you're going to leave, you're going to move on to another project. Or um, is it something where you expect the program to end when you leave, or do you expect the program to be in a position where it can continue going even if you and your program group aren't a part of the management of the program? So you need to decide that as soon as possible. Sustaining program more difficult, of course, because again, you're removing probably your resources in terms of finances, technology, personnel, and going off to help another group. Well, how are you going to fill those voids? Well, some things you can consider if you want to sustain the program in your absence. Okay, first one, working to institutionalize. So again, I'll use the worksite analogy. So working to institutionalize just simply means that this program or programs like this health promotion program simply become part of the mission of the organization you worked with. It becomes an established benefit to employees is that these types of programs are offered, right? And institutionalized just simply means that the organization values it and is committed to offering these programs. Seeking feedback, what were the likes and dislikes, right? Can you tweak them to make it more appealing for future participants? advocating for the program, right? Getting the word out within the organization that, hey, this was a productive program. It was successful. It brings a lot of benefits to the participants. Partnering with others, right? Are there other groups that, again, their mission statement aligns with what it is you were trying to do, that can kind of pick up the torch when you're gone and kind of fill in some of those gaps, maybe contributing resources, maybe contributing, personnel, that sort of thing. Revisiting and revising the rationale. Remember, so you created a rationale at the very beginning to sell this program to decision makers. And maybe you need to kind of revise that so that when the decision makers are called on, again, they're deciding if they want to sustain this program, that the rationale kind of supports that decision to sustain the program. And finally, establishing a resource development committee, right? These programs are always going to consume resources, right? How are you going to continue to feed the program in order to sustain it? Well, maybe putting a group together that, looks at fundraising, that maybe there's a grant writing component of the committee. Maybe there's a community solicitation group that goes out and tries to meet with business partners that can contribute. Okay, implementation of evidence-based interventions. So here's where it's best practices, right? You're taking examples of programs that have been successful, and you try to mimic their success within your organization by utilizing the approach that those successful interventions use. So in order to transfer the fidelity, right, following the program plan, some things you may want to kind of look at. So deconstructing the program into its components, right? Well, if you can get your hands on the logic model for those evidence-based interventions, right, that's what we're talking about with deconstructing, right? So the idea is you want to replicate what they did to hopefully produce duplicate results. Identify agencies that are ready to replicate the intervention. Again, getting your partners, making sure that you can address each component. Closely monitor the fidelity of the program, right? Here's where your process evaluation comes into play, to make sure you're following the plan as it was intended. Use evaluation tools of the program to track progress. So again, how are they evaluating the data that they were collecting in the successful intervention? Can you collect that same data? Can you evaluate it in the same way? Okay, so all these programs you're going to be working with people. So there's all sorts of considerations that go into working with human subjects. So safety and medical concerns. So we're dealing with health compromised groups, and for the most part, I mean, that's why we're there developing a program for this target population, is that we've identified some health issues, and we want to make sure that we're not doing anything to put our target population and our participants at a greater risk for harm based on those medical conditions. So you want to make sure that you're doing a needs assessment, collecting the amount of information where you can make that type of assessment. Okay, informed consent. We think back to the Tuskegee information materials. Right, we want to make sure that participants are participating of their own free will, and they're making the decision to participate with all the available and pertinent information necessary in order for an individual to make that type of decision. Right, so in order to get informed consent, right, explain the nature of the program. What's this program all about? What's its purpose? Here are the identified risks. Here are the benefits, right? So they can weigh out the pros and the cons. In form of alternative programs, this is not necessarily needed in every case. So here's an example where you may want to do that. You may have participation in a physical activity program on a work site, and one of the benefits of participation is that the employer has decided to reduce your monthly insurance payment. Well, maybe someone has a bad knee and they can't participate, but they still want to be able to have access to that lower monthly premium. So you may say, okay, well, in lieu of this physical activity program, we have a health education alternative, right? And the person goes through that, they get the benefit of the reduced premium cost. They may not get the benefit of the actual behavior change that people, potentially making in the other group, but some situations you may need to do that. Indicate that they are free to discontinue participation at any time, right? Here's the thing: these programs are voluntary participation, right? You don't want to force people into these things. So part of volunteering to participate is knowing that you can voluntarily decide not to participate at any given time. Allow participants to ask questions, right? As always, some people may have specific concerns that they can summarize in a couple questions. You answer those questions, alleviate those concerns. Okay, informed consent forms do not protect project planners from being sued. They're not liability waivers. We may say they're liability waivers, but with as litigious as society has become, I don't know if there's any foolproof way of doing this. But again, you just want to be forthcoming, make sure people understand the risks when they go forward. Okay. Example consent forms, they're all over, but basically you're explaining the nature of the program, the risks, the benefits, so on and so forth. It doesn't have to be a long document, and I would say in most cases a long document is not as likely to be read by everybody that's signing these forms. That's just how people can be. Again, especially if you're think about this. Oftentimes, and with health behaviors, health programs, right, we're going to get people to engage in healthy behaviors, probably include some type of physical activity. You just want to make sure that, again, you're not doing physical activity depending on the needs and characteristics of your target population that puts them at risk for injury. You may want to include medical clearance where a potential participant refers this with their physician, right? The physician does their assessment, say, hey, I don't recommend this, or maybe no, I think this would be great. They can sign off. Again, just another document you can have that you've addressed this with your target population. Other things to consider, again, thinking about liability. Well, maybe bringing people to campus to participate in your program. Well, you don't want them to park in an area campus that's kind of poorly lit, right? You want to make sure that everybody can participate in this program, get to the program in a safe manner. Just a checklist of things to consider. It's pretty straightforward stuff. Ethical issues, right? Never lose sight of this. Even if you don't identify with the group that you're working with in the program, is that we're all human beings, right? We all have basic human rights. The purpose of health promotion is to make people's lives better, right? And hopefully, the people that you have working in your program implementation, right, kind of all recognize that and just treat people fairly. But we want to make sure you review the code of ethics for health education professions, right? It's kind of just lays out what the expectations are, right? So okay, here are the things I should be doing, here are the things I shouldn't be doing, that sort of thing. The Belmont report, right? We've talked about that with Tuskegee, making sure that we're not doing anything, no matter how great we view the purpose of what we're doing, we're not jeopardizing or we're not lowering our ethical standards when we treat and how we deal with our target population. Right, we have respect for people. Right, everybody has deserved respect. Be treated fairly. This term beneficence. Right, we're trying to maximize benefits, doing good for the majority of people. Justice, right, fairness. We're treating everybody fairly. Pretty typical things, but again, maybe not everybody's kind of sees it this way, but right, we have to treat people as we would want to be treated ourselves. And legal concerns, there's always that element. Presence, so negligence, right, failing to act in a prudent, reasonable manner. So that's where probably some of the legal concerns would come in, is that showing that you were negligent and something happened to a participant. Two types of negligence: negligence by omission, right, doing nothing when you should, and commission, doing something you should not. So there's intent kind of comes into play there. But again, you just want to make sure that, again, from when you're doing your human resources, maybe you have someone with legal expertise to kind of review your procedures, your documents, how you do things, to again, make sure you're not getting into a situation where negligence could be a possibility. So reducing the risk of liability. Okay, so how do you want to kind of maximize the appropriateness of what you're doing? Right. First off, be aware of what your legal liabilities are, right, so that you can kind of double check and say, okay, am I doing things appropriately here? Be aware of professional standards, right? So with the CHES, the Certified Health Education Specialist, right? NCHEC does have guides that kind of explain what the standards are, so that you can kind of gauge, am I living up to those standards? Keep knowledge and skills up to date, right? Things do change as we learn things, right? You want to be on top of that and make sure that if there are improvements that have been discovered, that you're implementing those improvements. Using certified instructors, again, if you're giving nutrition advice, if you're leading people through physical activity, if you're giving medical advice, that the person giving the advice is qualified and certified to do so. Use good judgment. That should be, for everything. Require informed consent. Yes, if they're participating, right, you want to make sure that that participant's doing so of their own free will, and they've made that decision with all available and pertinent information. Getting medical clearance if appropriate. Limit work to expertise. Again, that should be something we all do. Provide a safe environment, and you may want to consider utilizing some resources to purchase insurance, because things can and do happen. You just want to make sure that you've got all your bases covered. Okay, program registration and fee collection. All right, so for registration, that's a no-brainer, right? You want to make sure you know who's participating, and so that you can kind of assign resources to them. Fee collection. I've kind of talked about this in the past. If you're going to use a fee to participate, right, you don't want the fee itself to be a barrier. So, make sure that if you're going to charge a fee, it's reasonable, it's justifiable, that sort of thing. For record keeping, right, HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability Accountability Act, right, just make sure you keep people's information private. Or you limit access, or those types of things. If anonymity is something that is necessary, right, how are you maintaining anonymity? Right? If it's confidentiality, how are you securing access to that data? So again, these are human beings, these are people. You're collecting personal information. If you say that you're going to protect that information, then make sure you do that. Procedural manual or participant manual. Again, what it comes down to is here are the expectations so that everybody knows where the bar is, right? Everybody knows what's expected of them. Manuals can do that. Maybe you have in there, a series of steps to carry out, right? Again, so everybody understands what it is they're doing, how they are to do it. A manual kind of outlines all the procedural steps so that if you wanted to replicate this program, you could do so exactly as the manual states. It makes it easier to follow along. So that may be something that you want to look into. And then program participants with disabilities, right? There's always going to be special considerations. I was on a dissertation committee with a young lady that was using Zumba classes with cognitively impaired adults, and there were a lot of considerations to include. For example, even though many of them were adults, some didn't have I guess the legal ability to make decisions with regard to participation, so their caretaker or their legal guardian had to agree to participate. The way or the language that was used in the education, right, had to be addressed so that it was understandable by these adults because of their cognitive disability. So again, you just want to make sure that you're doing everything that's appropriate. Training for facilitators. Again, you want to make sure that if you have someone doing a job that they are qualified to do that, and if they aren't qualified, then you may need to bring them up to speed through training, right? So you need to think about how am I going to accomplish this. Dealing with problems, right? You're always going to run into problems and challenges. How are you going to do that? You're going to do this by committee, or is there going to be a single person that kind of works out the solution and implements the solution? And it may be a case by case type of thing. Documenting and reporting. Again, how are you recording all the data that's coming in for your program?